This year's philosophy symposium is on the problem of evil, why bad things happen to good people. Several of your fellow students and invited philosophers will reflect on the central question of philosophy in the face of enormous amounts of what appears to be unproductive suffering in the world. Can one believe in a good and all-powerful God? Theology has asked a similar question, although we tend to assume that God exists. We ask, how can we think of God's goodness and power in the face of so much suffering? I don't propose to answer these questions, which have troubled many for centuries, in the next 8 minutes, but to explore the question itself with you. This is a question which really could be asked more wisely than we often do. But it's also a question we don't set out to ask, but rather that we find ourselves asking in the face of unexpected events. It's a place we have gathered in this place to ask several times in my time here in utterly personal ways as we grieved people we loved, Linda, Elisa, Michael, Jessica, Maria Celeste, Gil, Lindy, and the list can go on, and I'm going to stop so that I can go on. When death snatched members of our community from us, we found ourselves asking these questions. We asked them when Twin Towers fell, when thinking of children dying in Africa simply because they did not have clean water. We asked them remembering fire hoses turned on peaceful demonstrators, remembering smoke rising from the chimneys of Auschwitz, remembering machetes raised in Africa, remembering guns fired before Kosovo was free. In theology, it's a question that hasn't gone away, and it is a question that should not go away. So I begin with a kind of a cautionary tale, a true story from my own past. I had a friend in seminary whose brother was tragically killed in a car accident. And he got on a plane and he flew to the place where the funeral would be held and went immediately to the funeral home. And when he got there, the pastor, whom he had never met before, sauntered over to him in his leisure suit and stuck out his hand and said to him, "I'm sorry your brother died. God must have wanted him in heaven." And my friend cocked back his arm and struck the pastor in the chin and knocked him out cold in the middle of the funeral home. When I hear this story as a person of faith, I find myself taking my friend's side. I believe that he was acting more faithfully in this story than the pastor. To pretend that one can enter so quickly and easily to explain away the real loss in a situation is itself an act of violence. The pastor, therefore, took the first swing, and my friend responded to that violence out of his own grief. Perhaps some might say that the problem was the timing of the pastor's answer, not the answer itself. It was insensitive to answer this question while grief was so fresh. It is true that there is a time and a place to answer the questions that this man's death inspired, and that the funeral home was probably not it. But even more, I fear that the pastor's polyester answer resembles that often given by Christians in being simplistic and ultimately unsatisfying. When we try to fit God's goodness and God's omnipotence and the reality of unproductive suffering all together, the church has often opted, like the pastor, to deny the real problem of suffering and diminish the scandal of death's persistent power in God's creation. And we've done this, in order to defend, supposedly, God's goodness and power. To use a phrase I learned from Dr. Meadow, We have severely euphemized the reality of evil in order to defend God's honor. And I'm here on God's behalf to say God does not desire such a defense. And the Bible more consistently presents the demand that we call evil by its true name. The prophets, the author of Job, the evangelist, Jesus himself called attention to evil and injustice rather than explaining it away. They challenged it head on, even if it would mean their own death. In the face of injustice, they cry out, even to God, as an act of faith. Why are you not doing what you have promised us? How long, O Lord, how long? And they also turn to us to ask, and why do you also fail to act? My wife, who's a pastor, heard this cry recently in a poem written for a funeral of a 20-year-old named Daniel who died of a cocaine overdose. And the griever's prayer said this to God. O God, lover of Daniel and of those who grieve his loss, you didn't seem to know either how to shield him from the death of his father or the ravages of cocaine. Your light also was not bright enough so he could find his way. We had hoped for more from you, from ourselves. Death is too much for us. This cry to God against God is an act of faith. Several years ago, one time when I was rarely sitting in the back of the chapel, I remember a rabbi coming to us and saying to us, you Christians teach God as though you're so fragile, that if you say the wrong thing in prayer, God will fall apart. But we Jewish people know that we can take our best punch at God and God can handle it. I think it is good to learn from our faithful brothers and sisters who are Jewish in this aspect. As I said earlier, there is a season for everything. And for those of you who are not dwelling deeply right now in the shadow of death, who are not standing in the funeral home lobby, you have the kind of opportunity TLU often presents us with, to listen to fellow students and invited scholars who have struggled long and hard with difficult issues and offer reflections to sort them out in helpful ways. I hope you will go to the many talks that our students have set up and learn from these philosophers, both young and old. Learn how to ask these questions even more poignantly, more precisely, more wisely, and how to respond to them more articulately. They bring us the gift of thoughtful reflection that may help us to understand suffering better the next time life throws these questions at us. But even as I hope that this will be true, I recall the warnings of the great Sufi master Hafez, who said this: Dear world, I can offer an intelligent explanation for our suffering, but I hope it really makes sense to no one here. And come tomorrow, you are again at God's door with axe and pickets, eloquent petitions and complaints. With this warning and invitation, let the reflections begin. Thank you.